Welcome back to The Learning Curve, a podcast where we highlight expert educators and showcase their innovative ideas. My name is Irtaza Asser, and today we're going to be diving into a topic that's really shaking up traditional learning methods. And this idea is called gamification. To set the stage for this conversation, think about the last time you really enjoyed learning something. Maybe it was a language app like Duolingo that kept you motivated with streaks or badges. Or maybe it was a fitness tracking app that made you hit new milestones. The question is, why don't we harness the same engagement and excitement for medical education? Imagine a world where medical students aren't just memorizing facts, but they're actively competing for badges, solving clinical puzzles, or unlocking new levels of expertise. What if training for a high-stakes resuscitation felt less stressful and more like an interactive challenge that kept you engaged, motivated, and constantly improving? Today, we're going to be exploring how gamification is revolutionizing medical education, making learning more engaging, interactive, dare I say, even fun. And to help navigate us this exciting topic, I'm joined by Christopher Yang, one of the medical education fellows at the University of Missouri, who has been at the forefront of integrating gamification into medical training. He is an expert in this topic, and today his expertise is going to help us break down key components of gamification, as well as understand real-life applications and tackle the challenges of bringing game-based learning into medical training. Chris, how's it going?
Good, man. How are you?
Living the dream, man. I'm so excited to have you on. This was a topic that I really wanted to cover for a long time, and I couldn't think of anybody better for this topic than you. And just as kind of a side note, for anybody that ever runs into Chris at any conference, he is a stellar gamer. If you need him to carry your Counter-Strike team or your League of Legends team, he is your guy. He will 100% carry you guys to wherever you need to go. So approach him, confront him about it. It'll be great.
Well, thankfully, I'm a much better doctor than I am a Counter-Strike or League of Legends player these days.
But I'm gonna get you an actual like emergency medicine like team from conferences that they're gonna line up. It'll be great. Okay,
perfect.
So let's get started. Chris, talk to me about gamification. What exactly is gamification?
Yeah, so I think gamification, when a lot of people think about it at first, it's taking gameplay elements, like you had mentioned, things that make playing a game fun and applying them to an educational setting. I think it is important to contrast that with something that we call serious games. And those are games that are built from the ground up for a purpose other than entertainment. So say you're building a game from the ground up to teach triage skills or resuscitation skills or something like that, which is oftentimes a little more difficult to implement. Gamification is one of those things that the bar to starting is actually quite low. And there are a lot of great examples of ways you can incorporate it into your educational curriculum from the resident level all the way up to fellows, attendings, faculty, and really make the content more engaging and hopefully help learners retain the information better.
I think that's a really great description of what gamification is. So for somebody that's not really that familiar with it, I feel this is something that's almost a part of our daily life. Do you have any life examples, aside from just in medicine, about how gamification really affects us as individuals and how it's a part of our daily life?
Yeah, and you had touched a little bit on it in the introduction as well. Gamification kind of scratches that dopamine itch that we all have, right? The big thing that everyone kind of knows about that was big during COVID is Duolingo for language learning, right? The content itself is not revolutionary in what Duolingo is teaching you. It utilizes written, auditory, a lot of the same content that you get in the traditional setting. But what has made it really engaging and kept a lot of learners hooked on it is that bird on your home screen staring at you every single day, right, with your streak and wanting to keep that streak, wanting to, keep earning badges and earning points as you progress. I think a lot of the things that make games and gameplay fun have a lot of natural overlap with what we do as educators and in medical education, learning in general. I like to think of things like, say, let's take a game that probably a lot of people have heard about, something like Legend of Zelda. The more recent Legend of Zelda games have a real big focus on puzzles and exploring the world around you with puzzles. You have quests to undertake, and those kind of feel like learning objectives when you're dealing with a piece of education, medical education content, right? There's points and badges, which in our sphere are grades and awards, which we've had since we could barely walk, right? There's that sense of collaboration, competition. You want to work with your team. You want to be the best individually. You see a lot of that in those traditional games, as well as kind of what you do in the learning sphere. The learning from failure is another really big part of both a lot of gameplay elements, as well as kind of what we do as day-to-day emergency physicians. You learn from your past experiences and use those to build moving forward.
That's actually a really cool example of why gamification works, especially from a non-medical standpoint. So if we transition this conversation to the medical side, before we dive into why it works in medical education, what are some of the key elements that a listener has to understand with regards to gamification?
I think at its core, a lot of the tenets of gamification overlap well with a lot of the big educational philosophies in medical education and just in learning theory in general. And you could spend hours and hours kind of getting into the weeds and mapping it all out. A couple of different applications of traditional learning theory that I think tie really well into gamification and what make gamification fun. There's the concept of the zone of proximal development, which is the very fancy term of operating in your yellow zone, right? Which is, I think, as physicians, where we tend to do our best learning, right? If you're in the green zone all the time, you're seeing your 50th URI of respiratory season, and you're not really getting much out of that. And I'm sure everyone remembers when they were a PGY1, brand new out of medical school, being thrust into a super high acuity scenario, whether it's a trauma or a resuscitation, and not really being able to learn a lot from that experience because your only emotion is fear, and that overwhelms you. It's the middle of the ground, yellow zone, the patients who come in, maybe with shortness of breath, who initially on the surface look like a straightforward COPD exacerbation that end up being a little more nuanced than that, and that really kind of scratch that brain itch and challenge you. I think that's what a lot of people find in gameplay elements as well. Kahoot, that's been hugely popular over the past 5-10 years, a trivia-based way of teaching different topics. There's enough components of it, the music behind it, the leaderboard with the points, to push you towards that yellow zone where you're a little more cautious, maybe a little more fearful, but also not overwhelmed, and also not just cruising along and being a passive taker of the information.
That's actually a really cool point with regards to the zone of proximal development. And I think that has a lot of significant impact in terms of trying to get learners to be engaged with the idea of gamification. And not even just gamification, but just medical education in general. When you have folks in that yellow zone, they tend to learn the best because, yeah, they're comfortable, but they're not too comfortable. So they're always constantly engaged. And I think that's one of the reasons why I found that gamification tends to work really, really well. So from your standpoint, what are some of the benefits towards incorporating gamification in medical education?
I think the big one is making that push from passive learning to active learning, which is no secret in the realm of medical education. People have been promoting that for years and years now. And incorporating gamification, when done well and done correctly, does push folks from being passive learners into taking a more active role in their education and learning.
That makes sense. And I think about it in this concept that, you have a lot of these incredible cognitive benefits that are happening specifically with regards to active learning, which you said really makes sense. You're going from that traditional, hey, sit down, I'm going to give you a PowerPoint lecture, and that passive input towards more of an active approach where there's an objective, there's a reward, there's a prize, and you get these folks that are now actively participating in terms of whatever topic that you're trying to teach them on. I could give a cool example. I recently had to give a lecture on hernias and anal rectal disorders. And I looked at that topic.
What an exciting topic.
I know. And I was like, man, this is not a topic that can be pleasant. So I was like, I can stand up on stage and I can lecture for didactics for half an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. But the problem is I don't think I'll be able to connect with my learners. There's a wise individual that once told me that about 90% of the material that you convey during a lecture gets forgotten within 7 days. So a lot of the material that I'm covering is more relevant. So I thought to myself, okay, how can I flip this? And that's where the idea of gamification came to me is, can I make anal rectal disorders and hernias interesting and engaging for my learners? So I switched it into a Jeopardy model to try to incorporate that into our curriculum and also try to engage my learners a lot better. I got feedback from the residents afterwards, and the feedback was very positive. I had different categories, and we kind of did double Jeopardy and final Jeopardy. And I thought overall it was very well received. And that was probably the most engaged I've had residents with that specific topic, especially when I compare it to previous topics. So I definitely think what you're saying makes a lot of sense with regards to incorporating gamification in medical education. So Chris, what are some other real world examples of how we can incorporate gamification in our medical curriculum?
When I think of ways of gamifying medical education and the medical curriculum, particularly in the resident setting, I kind of think of things in almost a 3x3 grid or on two different axes. There's how often you're going to be using it, whether this is a one-time thing that's reproducible, say, like taking a lecture and putting it into a Jeopardy format or putting it into a Kahoot format. And then there's more repeated things if you're doing a longitudinal kind of game-based PBL or TBL type curriculum. There's also kind of different tech levels when it comes to how you're going to gamify the content. Things like a Kahoot, things like Jeopardy, there's a lot of initial upfront work into taking the content and putting it into that gamified form, finding the right PowerPoint format, finding the right tools to present your questions. But once you put in the work, it's done, and you can utilize that over and over and over. And then there are more high-tech, so to say, gamified things. And really the big thing that comes to mind when I think of that are things like escape rooms, which, again, hugely popular during the COVID boom, right? And as with many things that were popular there, it kind of permeates into everything we do in life. I'm a big fan of things like escape rooms. I think they're a great way of promoting active learning, getting learners up and out of their seats, which they show helps retention as well, just the simple act of standing up, moving around, and things like that. I think it excels in taking topics that are traditionally pretty dull and boring and trying to add a little bit of spice to them. So one of the things that we do every year is we have a didactic block that's dedicated to the admin side of things, our patient safety reporting portal and things like that are traditionally kind of feel like nails on a chalkboard dry, just listening to a lecturer from admin come and talk to you for 4 straight hours, right? So
don't get me in trouble, man.
Yeah, sorry. No offense to everyone who loves doing admin things.
No, I can relate. Yep.
From the resident side of things, you just had this great, fantastic, didactic about crashing pulmonary hypertension, and now it's how do I type in, these reports and stuff like that. So what we did was every year we take it and we turn it into an escape room where the residents will go through different stations. One station is a crossword puzzle where the clues that you need to fill out are different patient safety aspects. There's maybe particular QI cases where we have to go through, identify missteps. There's a room where there's 6 different chest x-rays with appropriately and inappropriately placed chest tubes, central lines, and identifying, okay, which one's correct, which one's not correct, and using that to get puzzle pieces. Collectively, they'll kind of cycle through the different rooms in the simulation center, go through each of these activities, get a piece of the puzzle, and then be able to unlock their final reward. And the resident group team that does it the fastest always gets a reward that is themed around whatever holiday we're kind of doing this for. So in the past, we've had Thanksgiving themed ones. They got a giant stuffed turkey, giant stuffed St. Patrick's Day plushies and things like that. But I do think there's a huge benefit in just getting them up and out of their seats and moving around. It helps promote teamwork. We found that breaking these groups up into folks with different PGY levels, particularly in the beginning of the year, gets them to work with each other and kind of know each other a little bit better as well, so that the conference days aren't just segregated into your group of PGY3 learners, PGY2s, PGY1s, all separated and not really kind of interacting with each other. Probably most well-known is just our high fidelity simulation, which in itself is a gamified way of dealing with resuscitations, teaching traumas and things like that. A kind of cool sphere of simulation over the past couple of years has been the integration of VR sim, which has been a big thing in several different sim centers. We're lucky enough that we have a VR sim station at each of our monthly simulation sessions where we'll work with in the VR space to essentially do what we would do with traditional high fidelity mannequins. But there's so many gameplay elements in that. There's a giant checklist that you can pop up on the big whiteboard for the learners to look at as they're going through the case, as they progress and identify the correct parts of the case or give the correct treatments.
Those are some awesome ways of implementing gamification into your curriculum. What's been the response like from the residents when you guys have done things like this? I know specifically I've heard of folks doing escape rooms with toxicology concepts, but the patient care one is actually really innovative and very cool. But what's been the response like from the residents?
Yeah, so I think anytime you get them out of their seats and give them something that's different than the traditional talk at you with a PowerPoint lecture, it's received well. Now, I think there is still a place for that, right? Different content is best taught in different ways, and having a healthy mix of group-based activities, gamified activities, traditional lecture, I think is the best way to keep everyone engaged. But particularly with the topics that are traditionally perhaps less exciting from the resident standpoint to learn, the response has been primarily positive when we've taken these gameplay elements, escape rooms, Kahoot quizzes, things like that, and taught the material in that method instead.
Just from my experience as well, I think gamification has been overwhelmingly well received anytime we've tried to incorporate it into our medical curriculum. One of the things that we always struggled with is how can we make board review engaging? So for the past year to 2 years, they've done a Dungeons and Dragons series every month to try to get residents even more engaged and get them more buy-in. And one other additional thing that they started recently incorporating was this idea of this quiz website where everybody can pick an anonymous name. And usually people pick funny names that are affiliated with the topic that we're talking about. And the idea is that the top scorer, we keep their score in check. And then eventually at the end of the year, whoever is the top scorer, they win a prize and they essentially get this WWE style title belt. So we've been incorporating things of that nature. And I think I remember you told me you guys did something similar. Is that right?
Yeah, we have something similar for our simulation side, though with elements of board review as well, where we also have a fantasy football style giant belt. It's the learners compete for it throughout the year. You get points for attendance to sim events, but more importantly, you get points for engaging in these types of group activities. So if you're there for our gamified boards review, boards cards review, GI review, whatever it may be, you'll get additional points if your team successfully scores the most points in that game. And also in our simulation events, the faculty judge the teams that go through. And it's not necessarily who gets the diagnosis the fastest, but the points that are awarded really for the teams that work the best together. So trying to foster that, team-based environment.
That's really cool. And I think that's something, especially over a longitudinal time period, I imagine that's definitely going to get more buy-in. And it's going to be something that your learners are going to be even more excited to learn that material, because now there's prizes, they're engaged, and you're essentially applying those core tenets of gamification that we talked about earlier.
I think the thing that really goes understated is people will do a lot for a small prize, right? You can think of all the times that you have done something small because you get a participation trophy or a participation medal or something like that honors your effort and time that you've put into something. And those small little tangible rewards do offer a lot of extrinsic motivation. And I think that's the big thing behind a lot of gamification of medical education in general, is trying to foster ways that you can extrinsically motivate learners to engage in the content. Now, that'll never replace intrinsic learning, but I think being able to have that and foster that extrinsic learning sets a good foundation that hopefully your learners can then develop their own sense of intrinsic learning afterwards.
And I think that's an excellent point. And just to kind of piggyback off that, so we've talked a lot about why gamification works and why we get more engagement from our learners. So if I'm a program director or I'm somebody that's looking to revamp my medical curriculum and I come to you, what would be some potential challenges or limitations that you would guide me on with regards to gamification?
The first gut reaction is always, we don't want to change how we've been doing this, right? And I think we're a little lucky that our specialty as a whole is relatively young compared to some other specialties, and we are very open and willing and adaptive to change. It's something that we do in our jobs every day. I think particularly the administration and the education folk in emergency medicine are also very open to change. Now, that being said, one of the biggest detractors to gamification is the amount of effort and work and time that you need to put in order to take content and gamify it. So taking your radiology review and putting it into a Jeopardy form or putting it into a Kahoot form or turning it into an escape room takes a lot of upfront effort, which is tough because everyone has a million other different obligations. There's also some concerns that when you gamify content, you cut down on the breadth of content that you're able to cover within a certain amount of time. So if you're giving a traditional PowerPoint lecture, you might be able to talk about all the orthopedic injuries and radiographic findings of the hand, forearm, and shoulder in a 1-hour session, for example. But if you're taking it and turning it into a Kahoot or a Jeopardy or any other type of game, there's naturally more engagement and you resultantly may cover less content, I think is another one of the big arguments that I hear. And you had mentioned earlier, my counter to that is, well, I'd rather cover 80% of the material and have it be very memorable and have my learners engage and retain that than cover 100% of the material and they forget it all within 7 days.
That's actually a really cool point that I just want to highlight again. I'll go back to my anorectal disorder lecture. When I did it through the traditional model and I had clinical time with residents following that lecture, I still felt like some of the things that we had communicated that showed up during our clinical setting, they weren't retaining. When I switched to the gamification model with Jeopardy and talking about some of the higher yield concepts, I noticed that the retention was definitely a lot better. I agree with you. And I think that's really the counter argument that I would give to somebody that basically brings up that issue with gamification. You're right. Faculty buy-in is very important. If you don't have faculty buy-in and you don't have people that are willing to do that upfront work, it's not going to work. And you really need to have that buy-in initially. So to segue off that, let's say you've convinced me. I'm going to incorporate gamification into my curriculum. Where do I start? Do I start big? Do I start small? If you had to design a curriculum, where would you start with gamification?
I think starting small and working your way up is always the best. I think finding particular topics that you think your learners are perhaps struggling with, or topics that are difficult to teach or don't have a lot of engagement, and finding ways to make those more fun and interesting. Even taking a traditional talk where you go through 100 different X-ray slides or pictures of skin diseases and finding a way to turn that into a game and having learners engage with that, and then building your way up from there. I don't think anyone wakes up and says, hey, I'm going to put a huge house-based point system in tomorrow, right? I think it's starting small with individual lectures, individual topics, and trying to show that, hey, we can make this fun and make this engaging and make this much more memorable. And everyone plays games these days. Something like 67% of all people of all ages play at least 1 hour of video games per week across the world, which is a huge number, right? We all engage in this type of content because it's fun, because we like seeing points, we like having badges, we like feeling challenged, we like being immersed. And I think those are all ways that things to keep in mind when you take content that may be difficult to teach or boring to teach, and making that more accessible for your learners.
Absolutely. And I think that's where gamification really works, right? Is you have an entire generation of folks like you and I that are growing up on video games. And you said 66% of folks are at least playing 1 hour of video games per week, right? So why not engage them? Because they're already a part of this gaming community and they're already familiar with some of the core principles of gamification. So why not utilize that for medical education? And I think everything that you said is something that I think would really help anybody that's looking to revamp their medical education curriculum or just try to simply just make it more engaging. So, Chris, what are the 3 key big takeaways from your standpoint with regards to gamification and implementation of gamification that a first-time listener can look at and say, hey, I'm going to bring this back with me?
I think first and foremost, gamification increases engagement with the material and hopefully retention of the educational content later on. I think 2, the core tenets of what make games fun to play actually overlap quite well with us as educators and the things that we are trying to promote and teach. And there are challenges, but I think starting small and taking a particular lecture series or particular lecture topic and making it more fun and engaging is a fantastic way to sort of dip your toes into the gamification realm and start exploring and seeing how we can take games and incorporate them into what we do for our everyday lives.
Absolutely. And I think those 3 key big takeaways for any first-time listener that's listening, I think are very valuable. Gamification is going to help with your retention. Your residents, your medical students, whatever your target audience is going to be more engaged with whatever principles you're trying to communicate. There's going to be so much more valuable retention that ends up helping your learners. And second of all, it's going to be fun, right? We want to make learning fun. And the times when people learn the best is when they're actually engaged and they're enjoying things. Chris talked about barriers that come up with gamification, but there's solutions to it, right? Faculty buy-in is very important. What we can also do is try to incorporate folks to try to do that upfront work early on so that the next time around you have to do it, it's not as challenging. And also trying to make sure that you're gamifying an appropriate amount, not trying to gamify too much, but you're trying to gamify and you're trying to start small and then slowly start to progress from there. Those are some really awesome key points that Chris, you brought up. Anything that I might have missed? Anything you wanted to add?
I'll say the only other thing I'll add is our learners are becoming younger and younger as we get older and older, right? And kind of bridging those generational gaps in teaching attitudes. I think this will continue to be more and more adopted as more and more Gen X, Gen Z individuals enter medical school and residency training and beyond, right? And I think keeping up with attitudes and perspectives about education and learning and being open to things like adding gameplay elements. I think as educators and young educators, we're always trying to think of new ways to do things, right? And kind of keeping up as things progress.
Absolutely. And I think this is going to be one of the best ways we can connect. And you're right, man. We're getting older, and the things and approaches that worked 10, 15, 20 years ago, yeah, they have a place to an extent, but they might not connect with our learners today. I think gamification is a great way to bridge that gap and try to get to our learners and try to help them achieve the best things that they can do on their own. Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This was a fantastic episode, and there's a lot of great takeaways. And from my standpoint, I think gamification is really cool. And you've really helped us to better understand this, as well as try to tackle some of those barriers that come with gamification and implementation. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. This is definitely a topic that you could spend hours and hours and hours talking about. So hopefully folks will get a little bit of a sense, a little bit of a taste of what it is, how you can use it, and kind of go from there.
Absolutely. And Chris, is there any place on social media where folks can reach out to you to talk about gamification a little bit better, or if they have any questions, they can approach you?
Yeah, so I'll shout out our emergency medicine residency page on Instagram, Mizzou, Mizzou, emergency medicine. We post pretty frequently there, including every time we have a sim event. And oftentimes you'll see there how we're incorporating gamification into our simulation or didactic curriculum. We'll have examples of our escape rooms and other games that we do there. And then my Instagram is at National Park Stock. I'm not affiliated with the national parks. Maybe I will be one day. I just love going to them. And I try to post some educational content there, as well as some of the ways that I'm incorporating gamification as well. And pictures of all the parks, if that's something you're interested in.
Absolutely. I'm actually going to send this episode to Yellowstone and get you that Yellowstone sponsorship.
Perfect.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I'll also put the social media shout outs on the show notes. So for anybody that's interested in following Chris or seeing what his program is doing with gamification, so they can take some ideas and try to incorporate that into their curriculum, that'll be in the show notes. And to leave some thoughts for you guys, what have you guys done for gamification in your training? How has that helped your learners? Share your thoughts. Let's continue the conversation. Thank you guys again for tuning in to another episode of The Learning Curve.